Thank you. It's great to be here. I have to say, after that outstanding talk, my talk feels very trivial in comparison. And not only that, but apparently I'll be out of a job in short order. So maybe it's good that I'm turning my attention from data science to ethics, which may or may not have a role in the future. But I really want to focus on online consumer product experimentation because it's such a prevalent practice these days. And I'm interested in exploring the topic of ethics as it relates to this. So for those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with experimentation, there are probably a few, maybe one or two of you out there, just a high-level touch point on what it is. We take a population of people, typically the users of an internet product or service, pull a random sample from those folks, and then produce two different versions of the product or service, and we show those different versions to these random samples of people. And what's great about that is we can then analyze the results and get a read on causality, which in general in analytics, right, we believe is better than correlation, right? So we love this from a business and product optimization perspective because it really helps us zoom in on what customers really like or what's effective with folks in the product. So this has turned into a huge business. This is merely one slide I pulled on the number of different tools that are out there and that are getting used to help support this experimentation, right? Huge business, huge prevalent practice. And the products that are heavily using experimentation, such as Netflix, and I will use a number of Netflix examples along my way today, these types of companies are running hundreds or even thousands of experiments at one point in time. And the implication of this on customers and consumers out there is that when you're doing anything on the web, which many of your products and habits and whatnot are through products that are connected to the internet, you're in many experiments along the way. And often you're in many experiments even within the same product. The notion that there is a core product and then a few experiments running on the side is not even close to reality. It's more like there's no one product for any of these internet products out there. These products have thousands of mini versions running at one time. And so I believe that consumers and people out there don't quite realize the extent of this. Even recently, I was giving an internal talk at Netflix, and someone asked, oh, how many experiments is the average Netflix member in at the same time? And I stated a number that was around 10. And the audience erupted in shock that was really what's going on. Now, granted, these experiments are pretty small when you really think about the customer experience. So it's not like one customer is getting recommendations and another customer is not even getting any recommendations. Typically, these experiments are smaller tweaks. So it's actually less shocking than that number makes it feel. But nevertheless, consumers really are participating in many, many experiments that they may not be aware of. So I did just a quick search on the ethics of online A/B testing because I was curious to know whether others have done research in this area. And it really drew pretty much a blank. You can see that the results there, most of the results are highlighting a couple of experiments that got a lot of press back in mid-2014. And then there's one in there from 2016 on a course where someone's highlighting exploring the ethics in a class. So that's great. But I really couldn't find anything specific to the ethics of online testing. The experiments that got a lot of press, I'll just touch on those briefly. So you may or may not have heard about this Facebook experiment run through Facebook where they were studying emotional contagion and whether or not that can occur without human-to-human interaction and instead through online things that people are reading. And so what they did was they, in the news feed in Facebook, they altered the algorithm that's picking the items to show in the news feed. And for one test cell, they showed more negative sounding things with more negative or upsetting sentiment. And in another test cell, they showed things with a more positive sentiment. But these were all posts from their friends. So it's not like they took a post that a friend had and then took out the negative words or added positive words. It wasn't anything like that. They merely shifted which posts they were showing on the news feed. And you can see the result. They did find a statistically significant result that the people who were shown sort of the more negative sounding things posted more negative sounding things or posted less. and vice versa. So they did find this effect. Now, I just am curious, a quick show of hands. I've talked to many people about this experiment, and some people just feel that this is no big deal. It's just an experiment. They weren't really altering the product itself from what it normally does so dramatically, and it's just an algorithm that's showing that. And other people feel very violated by this. I'd like a quick show of hands on how many people, who does it trouble? Who feels troubled on from an ethical perspective? OK. A little more than half, it looks like. Some of the other experiments that got press right around that same time, which may just be because of time proximity, are these experiments that were run on OkCupid, which is a dating site. One of the experiments tried to understand the importance of pictures versus text in your online dating profile. And so what they did is they randomly removed either the picture or the text when they were showing these profiles to folks. And for this one, they found that people care about the pictures. We're all so shallow. So how many folks does that one bother? Raise your hand if it bothers you from an ethical perspective. Many fewer than before. And then what about the second one here, where they were trying to learn the impact of the percent match score? So you'll see some profile gets recommended to you, and it says 90% match. They knowingly just flipped that percentage. So if it was 90%, instead they said 10%. So they dramatically changed their algorithm that was showing this percent match score. But they kept the same underlying profile that they were showing you. Again, raise your hand if this troubles you from an ethical perspective. Many people. Wow, almost as many as the Facebook experiment. OK, great. So I'm actually not going to come back to these experiments later. I thought about coming back and doing a deep dive on these, but I'm not. I'll leave that to you in your free time later to further contemplate these. So in other industries that do conduct experiments, there's a lot of rigor around the ethics around that, particularly when it comes to pharmaceutical research, healthcare research, or anything like this that's really truly human subjects research. And in the US, there's the common rule. Many of you may know about this if you've been involved in academic research. So these kinds of things put some control around things. And the origins of all this really stemmed from a much more extreme scenario back in World War II with the war crimes and these horrific kinds of experiments that were conducted at that point in time. That led to a lot of rigor and studying and people really trying to come up with codes of ethics to help prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. And that's obviously a far cry from what we're doing in most internet online types of experiments, right? Very, night and day types of things, for the most part, that we're doing in online consumer product testing, right? And in particular, I think this is a really great phrase to kind of know and understand in terms of how folks think about the minimal risk that we're willing to incur, which is really bounded by kind of the normal experience in life. And how much more than that are we altering something in an experiment? So I feel that one way to sort of think about this in a perhaps conservative way for the online experimentation industry is to really ask ourselves, what can we learn from all that history and all the work that's gone into trying to codify ethics for human subjects research. So a couple things before I go into that. I'm not an ethics expert yet. I have done a lot of data science, a lot of experimentation in my time. And so what I'm expressing here is really my own perspective and way of thinking about this issue. Data privacy is a very critical thing. It's not exactly the focus of my talk today. I do think that many sort of ethical challenges in experimentation also involve data privacy. To me, that's a no-brainer. It's also gotten a lot more attention and a lot more care from the legal system, et cetera. So it's not explicitly the focus of my talk. And then I'm also focusing on logged-in consumers. I feel that the cookie traffic, first off, you don't know which person you're dealing with. Secondly, the data is typically lighter about cookied traffic than logged-in people. And then also because the data is richer, when you're logged in, there's typically much more data that's getting collected about you, then I think that offers more opportunity to actually get into these ethically challenging areas. So I'm going to focus on the logged in case. I would love to find examples of things that to me felt unethical in a cookied state. So if anybody can think of examples of that later, I would love an email from you, because I would love to just kind of stack up some examples of cookied experiments that were questionable on ethics. So here, just to review the core principles from human subjects research, the first is informed consent, really letting people who are participating in an experiment know that they're in an experiment and provide their consent. And it also involves, these are my own words trying to summarize this, it also involves protection for categories of people who really can't make their own decisions, such as children. The second principle is around beneficence. So this is where we're really in an experiment trying to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm. So it's what is that trade-off, which obviously is a very tricky and fuzzy thing. But what is that trade-off between benefit and harm that seems ethical in an experiment? And the third is around justice or fairness. And this is really about making sure that the burdens of participating in experiments and the benefits reaped from the experiments are shared with the same population. So that's sort of the concept of justice. So I want to walk through each of these and contemplate what are the sort of things that are more concrete within the online experimentation space that we can think about in terms of these three areas. So on informed consent, to me, it seems like an absolute no-brainer that any company that's doing experimentation ongoing should include that in their terms of service. It's a pretty easy thing to do. I think many companies are doing this. From my own sort of searching around online, I found that many companies do somewhere in their terms of service, buried in there, they have a clause around, by using this product, you're participating, we're an experimentation company, and et cetera. So most companies are doing that. The problem, of course, is who reads the terms of service. I mean, I had to pull up the Netflix terms of service, and even with my own passion about Netflix and caring about this topic, it was such a slog to read through the terms of service. And you can see over there how far this is a lot of text already, and I've only scrolled a teeny bit of the top right. People really aren't spending their time reading the terms of service. So I don't really feel that this gets us to informed consent. One thought is to focus on the informed piece a bit. I think these kinds of things could help. Should we do more education just in general for consumers about what is your experience when you're in your daily life as you're using so many internet products and services? What does that mean? And educating people around the fact that they are participating in experiments and that these experiments are typically lighter things so that it's not scary, right? It's not necessarily a scary thing. In the end, hopefully it benefits the consumer. So I think one idea is to try to get more out there, more information out there. Another idea that's probably a little more controversial is, should companies do something more active themselves? Imagine if Netflix were to send you an email once a year and say, oh, you know what, last year you participated in 25 experiments. Thank you for helping us make the product better. X% of those experiments won, and hopefully you're enjoying your experience with Netflix even more than you did a year ago, right? Very controversial idea, but are there other things like that that maybe aren't as threatening to companies that could really help the consumers understand that they are participating? Consent is another area that I think is important. And my favorite idea here is to have companies have an option in your settings, in your account settings, where you can opt out of testing. And it would have to be sort of opt out of all testing. Nobody in the industry is going to try to ask for every single experiment. Hey, do you want to sign up for this experiment, right? That's just a showstopper really for the whole concept in our applications. But I think kind of this universal opt out of testing idea is really an interesting one. And it's great for the consumer, right? Because the people who care about this can go in and really get themselves out of that. It is hard to communicate the benefit of the experimentation. So I do think that if you forced people to answer the question, do you or do you not want to participate in experimentation, many more people would say no than really sort of need to, who would actually care if they truly understood the experiments that are getting conducted, and the fact that the experience is not so dramatically different than the basic experience in the product. So that's a hard piece of this idea. And the other is, if a lot of people opt out, then you're obviously risking biasing your test results. So I do want to share that we have been doing this at Netflix for a number of years before the blowups in 2014. And I thought I'd share it just for some information, right? We have it not buried just like as part of the normal test settings. And then when you click on it, it just has this one simple statement. And what I really wanted to share is the percentage of members who have opted out. It's about 0.5%. So it's pretty small. Now, the question is that because people haven't found it and they're not looking at their account settings? I'm sure that's a lot of it. Now that I've told you this, well, first off, raise your hand if you're a Netflix member. Wow, thank you. And then keep them up. Now, put your hand down if you're, or keep it up if you're going to now go in and opt out of experimentation. A few people. Oh, good. So that's good. I think it's fair, and I think it's the right thing to do. So this is just a recommendation I have for the community. Protection is, I think, a little tougher because there are many products and services that don't necessarily ask age or other kinds of things in login and don't even have that data. So how do we protect children and other classes of people who we really, we should be extremely careful around the experimentation practices here. By the way, this is another reason I like the idea of opt-out of all testing, because Netflix people share the account, and there may be children in the household as well. And so for parents who are aware of experimentation, they can go in and opt out of their experimentation, and that also opts their kids out of experimentation, right? I think this is particularly challenging. I don't have any great answers. I'm bringing it up as an awareness thing for folks to think about. The second principle, beneficence. So again, this is about maximizing the benefit, minimizing the harm, and considering that trade-off. So here's my perspective on how we could think about this in the online industry. First off, I think that the hypothesis that you have going into the test and the intent of the test really matter a lot and contribute toward this concept of beneficence. And I've sort of listed here in descending order my own opinion of types of tests that are better at beneficence and worse at beneficence. The majority of experiments out there really do fall into that top bullet point, right? They're a hypothesized improvement. I mean, come on, companies are wanting to make the product better so they can make more money, and yes, we want to make customers happy and all that kind of stuff, right? So most of the experiments already fall in that area, and that's great. I'm not saying that's sufficient for covering all aspects of ethics, but I think it's a great, on this particular dimension, that's a great one. There are many experiments that are also hypothesized or even known to be neutral, but they have some other benefit to the business. And so I think those are fine too. An example from Netflix might be we're changing the engineering platform to a different technology. The functionality for the customer is no different, but we want to make sure that we don't have bugs or some other thing that we can't tease out on our own. And so we might run an experiment to make sure that it's performing as well as the previous sort of technology underlying the product. The two I have question marks on, but I feel more negative on, are what if you have a known degradation or a hypothesized slight degradation to your product or service? But if you could learn about that thing, it would help you improve the product or service. An example, again, from Netflix is we have a lot of algorithms and whatnot that try to optimize the streaming experience. Once you click play to watch something, we're messing around with the bit rate and trying to reduce the rebuffers or minimize the rebuffers and all that kind of stuff, but also trying to give great picture quality, which takes a lot more traffic loading into your cache. And so we're often wondering how much customers care about how long it takes to start playing something once you click play. Because if you're willing to live with a little more delay, we can load the best bit rate and really reduce the rebuffers, et cetera. Right? And we don't really, even today, we still don't have a great sense on how much and where that boundary is on that start play delay for customers, right? So if we injected an artificial delay for example, of just like a few milliseconds, and we could do that for different thresholds, we would learn a lot, and we actually would be able to, we think, we would be able to make the product better for customers in that. So is that an okay experiment? I'm very mixed on that. So the other one, I think, is what if you want to learn the least harmful way to implement something that you know you're going to implement? You have to implement it, but you want to do it in the least harmful way, and you want to learn about that from the customer's perspective. An example here is, at Netflix, if we wanted to sunshine a device. We have thousands of devices that are able to stream Netflix. Some of those are older devices, and we have custom code and messiness that we have to maintain in order to keep those devices. And as the number of customers using that device dwindle, for us as a business, it's questionable, should we really keep this very tiny device running on Netflix and go through all this cost? So we know we want to take it away. And we've made this, let's say we made the decision, we're going to get rid of that device. It would be great to learn what's the best way to tell that to customers, you know? And so, but that would require an experiment where we would, if we were to do it, you know, through this causality method, right, we would want to run an experiment where we maybe sunsetted the device sooner for some members, or started telling some members about it sooner than other members, right? So that one's a little iffy as well, because other people are paying the same price and getting to use that device, and these members are not, right? So that to me is a little questionable. A no-brainer to me is if there's intellectual curiosity, but there's no intent to use whatever you would learn to improve the product or service and bring some benefit back to the people who are participating in the experiment, that to me is a no-brainer. I don't think that's great. So what about the degree of harm? I find this one pretty interesting too. You know, there are many experiments that are run where customers can't even detect that anything different is going on, right? They do actually sort of detect it because we're able to measure statistically significant results in things like engagement and whatnot. But consciously, people aren't really aware of the fact that anything's different. And so to what degree does degree matter? One idea is to try to focus on a clause that's sort of similar to the HHS clause around degrees of harm, minimum degree of acceptable risk. So we could have something that's like, hey, any experiment we're going to run, let's keep it within the bounds of the normal product experiment. So back to product experience. So back to my earlier example about play delay and artificially injecting play delay, perhaps we could say, well, hey, if we're within 2 standard deviations of the normal customer experience of play delay, then it's OK to do that. But if we were to inject, you know, many seconds of play delay that would bring us out 3 or 4 standard deviations, then maybe that's too much harm. It's just one idea. I think it's very heavy, and it would be very hard to implement this and really pay attention to it. But in a sort of softer way, you can, right? Because typically the people running these experiments at a company, we already know in our heads kind of the range of play delay, right? So it's actually pretty quick to just ask ourselves the question, hey, is this something outside those bounds? Thoughtfulness in review, IRBs are you know, sort of the government-regulated way to really make sure that you're running an experiment that's acceptable. I think that would be too heavy-handed for the online industry, but I do think we can do things internally to just at least put a measure of thoughtfulness and care and review on the whole thing. So if you're able to really have a group that's different, or people who are different than the person who's championing the experiment, right? Because they're going to feel really passionate about their experiment. They're going to be able to justify in their head why it's a good idea. You can have a separate entity at your company, or even a person, to just look at it and have a conversation and actually be thinking about it from this different perspective of ethics. I think that's a great idea. I think that goes a long, long way toward helping to put some amount of care and rigor around things. Responsiveness to results, this is a little stretch from the ethical perspective, but a good practice would be to launch wins as soon as possible and to end tests that are showing a negative result as soon as possible, right? Because you've already measured that it's a negative thing, just turn that thing off. The last category is justice or fairness. So here we want fair and equitable sampling. This is more of a technical thing, I think, that we can do that's very easy, just making sure that you're really thinking about sampling equitably and testing on the same population who would get the experience if it were to win. And the second bullet there is really the key, right? Don't experiment on one segment of your population and then roll out that benefit to a different segment of your population. An example for Netflix might be we would never take people in the lowest price point tier and tune our recommendations and make them great using them, because if they quit on us, they cost us less money. But then if we optimized the recommender system that way and launched it to everyone, to me, that's something that would really violate this fairness. Honoring the core contract you have with customers. Netflix, so no matter how much we run experiments on smaller things, we would always offer all the movies and TV shows, any time of day, and on all devices that are enabled on the product. Right? That's like our core service. So the kinds of things we're experimenting on for the same price, at least, would all be things that still offer that core service. Honoring that is key. And then employee skills and organizational structure, I think, is also really helpful. So as you know, on the technical side, it's very easy to screw up an experiment. It's very easy to not have a random sample. It's very easy to focus on the wrong representative sample. So having talent and experts at the company who really know this stuff and have that background is really important to helping this stuff get implemented properly. And then, again, separating people who are working on the experiments from a technical perspective from those who are designing the experiments from the business perspective. So just 2 more slides, my takeaways. Really my biggest recommendations are considering an experimentation opt-out, stretching within the company to align on your ethical approach and get people talking about it and paying attention to it, and then some sort of process that sort of reviews. It can be light, it can be heavy, but something where you're actually paying attention and being thoughtful. And I think there are sort of 3 questions for any one experiment that you're considering that you can just use as a gut check. If you don't want to digest all the other stuff I've talked about, just you're about to run an experiment. Let's do a gut check on whether it's a good experiment from an ethical perspective. Would we launch this to the whole customer base? Right? So if you're testing something that you would never launch, that's a problem. Something's wrong there. Should we feel good, or would we feel good about it if it were to hit the press? Not that the press is what we care about, but that's an interesting test to do for yourself. And then the last one is, would customers feel violated if they learned that they were in this experiment? And that's all I have. I don't know if we have time for any questions. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
So let's go right in front first, and then we'll come back.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'd love to talk to you since we're kind of pressed after, if you're around. I'm from a social science background, and so I'm familiar with experimentation. But one of and this was really great. You did a great job. One of the things that kept pressing on my mind, though, was that in a social science and an academic field, informed consent is so important. And I've trained people in other countries to run experiments in other languages. I can tell you it is so complicated, to make sure that people who don't have the right educational background, that they understand what they're getting into, And what I noticed was that it sort of seems like the tech world just doesn't, I don't know, seem like it's like really slow to getting onto that ship, because the academic ship has been sailing for a long time, And so I was listening and I was thinking, you have a lot of really smart people, at the company. Why does it seem like these questions to me sort of seem like they should have been had a long time ago, And that now it's like, oh yeah, we have a lot of people who are. We probably should include, test, a test option. Anyway, so do you see a change? Do you see that there's going to be a change?
I hope so. That's part of my motivation today. I really do feel like it's been a miss in the industry, and it's a little bit perplexing to me, given how much attention will come on other areas that are related, like data privacy, right? And so I hope more attention will be brought to it. I think a lot of it needs to be more public, more press about again, educating the consumer about what is their daily life like, their unknown sort of daily life when they're using all these services. That education to me is crucial. And then I think beyond that, there are things that individual companies can do.
Mic check? Okay. So first of all, thank you a lot for your talk. I really appreciated it. I appreciated it even more so because I work for an online video analytics company.
Ah.
So we sell to customers that want to be the next Netflix. Like, that's what they all say. And I'm like, well, how much money do you have? Anyway, no, I don't say that. But the funny thing is we have a product that we call our Discovery product, which is essentially a performance-based recommendations engine that we sell as an add-on to our product that can actually say, like, we can recommend data, or we can recommend content, TV content, based on what a user has watched, and we have the analytics behind it. And you mentioned separating, I think, the separation of technical and business stakeholders in some sense. And it's a different context because I'm kind of selling the product to people who are going to be making those decisions. But what I hear when I go out into the field and talk to customers are two responses. Either the customer or prospect will say, yeah, I want that right now. Or they'll say, like, and can I have everyone else's data too? All your other customers' data. Or they'll say, oh, I don't know about that. Like, this sounds really, let's talk about, like, the ethical considerations of it. How do you reconcile that, I guess, internally at Netflix?
Well, we're fortunate, I have to say, in that we've been thinking about this for a long time. Actually, thanks to our CEO, Reed Hastings, has been a big fan of thinking about this kind of thing from years ago. And so we're sort of just fortunate because we were already set up in a way that that we have a separate group that works on experimental design and analysis, and that group is separate from the product leaders who are innovating experiments. And we have forums where there's a lot of debate, and those two parties come together. And that's sort of been, for us, a natural place where we're kind of enabling that whole process of debate and consideration of both sides, right? So that we're just kind of fortunate. I think, again, back to just awareness in the industry, I really feel like that's the #1 thing that kind of needs to happen in order for your type of situation to not be as big of a barrier.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's take one final question.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. I think it's nice to know that companies are kind of considering ethics from a more sort of academic perspective. I'm coming to data science from an academic research background as well. So one thing that you did touch on was debriefing, and I'm wondering if there's any aspect of engaging with the person who you experimented on, getting their feedback about that experiment, and also if you consider the concept of opting in as opposed to just opting out. I think there's a sort of an important distinction between those two things.
Yes, absolutely, opting in versus opting out. So 2 questions. Well, on opting in versus opting out, we have certainly talked about it, right? I think the challenge to this industry in doing that is it really would just completely change the opportunity to even do all this testing. I really do. I think if you did opt-in, very few people would opt in, largely because they wouldn't understand how little impact the experiment is really having on them, and they also wouldn't understand the benefit that comes back to them. It just sounds threatening to say, oh, you're in an experiment, you're going to be in an experiment, right? So I think that the opt-in rate would be so small and biased that the whole industry and this whole way of optimizing products and services would just not be viable. So that's the challenge to me on that idea of opting in. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm a little, I'm not quite sure I'm a little bit divided about it. But I do think it would just obliterate the idea of doing this much experimentation as is going on in the industry. I'm sorry, what was your first one again? The
Debriefing.
Debriefing. Yeah, that's a great one. And we don't have any, we have talked about it, we don't have any sort of consistent process where for every experiment we would debrief or even divulge to people, oh, you just participated in an experiment and we've now launched X because of that experiment. We haven't done any of that kind of thing. We do a lot of consumer insights research, though, that is more for sort of bigger experiments where we are incorporating talking to people and asking them about their experience, but we're not necessarily telling them, oh, we're asking you because you had, we actually delivered that experience to you, and other customers got a different experience. So it's a great thing to bring up, and I haven't figured out how to fold that into my thinking yet.
Okay, great. Please join me in thanking Caitlin again.